The Atari 2700. The Atari 2700 is one of the strangest stories in gaming history because it represents a moment when ambition and technology crashed into each other long before the industry was ready. Atari wanted to build a home console that felt futuristic, something wireless, sleek, and more premium than anything the market had seen before. The reason the console failed before it ever reached consumers is simple. The technology they were trying to use simply did not belong in 1981. The controllers were the biggest disaster. The 2700 used radio signals instead of infrared, which meant they could pass through walls and floors. During internal testing, engineers discovered the controllers could operate a console from multiple rooms away, even outside the house, even across the street. This wasn't a feature, it was a nightmare. Imagine your neighbor playing a game and accidentally controlling your Atari without realizing it. Imagine kids fighting over whose controller was actually moving which character. Other electronics, garage door openers, and household devices interfered with it constantly. On top of that, Atari couldn't solve pairing issues because the concept of wireless pairing simply didn't exist yet. The controllers would connect to whatever unit responded first. It was unpredictable, dangerous, and impossible to market without legal consequences. Atari realized that releasing the 2700 would almost guarantee lawsuits, angry customers, and chaotic home interference issues. There was no way to fix it in time, no way to guarantee reliability, and no way to justify the risk. So despite having working prototypes and packaging designed, the Atari 2700 died internally. A console that was supposed to be ahead of its time was instead buried because the future it predicted hadn't arrived yet. The Sega Neptune. The Sega Neptune is one of those tragic stories where a console doesn't fail because of its own quality, but because the company behind it was in complete turmoil. During the early 1990s, Sega's hardware strategy collapsed under the weight of too many devices: the Genesis, the Sega CD, the 32X, and more. Each new device confused customers and fragmented the market, and the 32X ended up being the biggest mistake of all. Retailers hated it, developers ignored it. Customers were confused about whether they should buy the 32X or wait for the upcoming Sega Saturn. The Neptune was Sega's attempt to fix that disaster. Instead of continuing to sell the bulky 32X add-on, Sega decided to merge the Genesis and 32X into a single, clean, simplified console. This new system would have been affordable, less confusing, and more attractive to consumers who didn't want to deal with multiple attachments and cables. Sega believed they could bring back trust by making the 32X platform a proper standalone system. However, what killed the Neptune before it launched wasn't the device itself, it was timing. The Sega Saturn was only months away, and Sega's internal teams were divided. Some wanted to salvage the 32X, others wanted to move on entirely. Releasing the Neptune risked cannibalizing Saturn sales, splitting the market further, and frustrating developers who were already trying to keep up with Sega's chaotic hardware roadmap. Ultimately, Sega's leadership realized releasing another console just to fix a previous mistake would only create more confusion. With finances stretched thin and the Saturn demanding full attention, Sega abandoned the Neptune. It never launched, becoming a symbol of Sega's downfall and how too many overlapping ideas crushed the company long before the Dreamcast arrived. Only prototypes remain, reminding fans that the Neptune wasn't a failure of design, but a victim of Sega's collapsing strategy. The Nintendo PlayStation. The Nintendo PlayStation is the most famous canceled console in history, not because it failed, but because its failure changed the entire industry. In the early 1990s, Nintendo was still dominant, but they wanted to prepare for the inevitable shift towards CD technology. They partnered with Sony, who at the time was still primarily an electronics company with no presence in gaming. Together, they planned to create a hybrid console combining cartridges with CD-based expansion hardware. Behind the scenes, however, the partnership deteriorated step by step. Sony wanted control over CD licensing, which was where the real long-term profit would come from. Nintendo, known for tight control of its ecosystem, hated the idea of giving Sony that much power. At the same time, Sony's engineers were so advanced that Nintendo felt overshadowed by their partner. As negotiations collapsed, trust vanished completely. What happened next stunned the entire world. At the Consumer Electronics Show, Sony presented their partnership with Nintendo, proudly announcing the Nintendo PlayStation. But when Nintendo took the stage hours later, they publicly declared a completely different partnership with Philips instead. Sony leadership felt betrayed. The audience was shocked. The consoles were dead on arrival. The Panasonic M2. The Panasonic M2 is one of the most powerful consoles never released. It was originally meant to continue the legacy of the 3DO, a system that failed because of its high price and complex manufacturing model. But the technology behind the M2 was genuinely impressive. Engineers developed early real-time 3D tech that could have competed with the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, and Panasonic believed it could revive their standing in the gaming world. The problem was that the rest of the industry had already moved on. Sony's PlayStation was dominating the market with unstoppable momentum. Nintendo's upcoming N64 was generating massive hype thanks to games like Super Mario 64. Sega was trying to regain ground with the Saturn. In this environment, there was no room for another expensive system, with uncertain developer support. Panasonic struggled to convince major studios to develop games for the M2. Even with interesting demos, there weren't enough committed developers to justify a launch. Retailers didn't trust Panasonic after the 3DO's failure, and investors weren't convinced the company could compete with giants like Sony. The Sega Pluto. During the late Saturn era, Sega was desperately trying to regain customer trust after several hardware failures. The Sega Pluto was supposed to help accomplish this. It was essentially a redesigned Saturn with a built-in hard drive and integrated modem for online play. Sega dreamt of an online ecosystem long before Xbox Live and PlayStation Network existed. If the Saturn itself wasn't struggling, the Pluto would likely have launched and become a major leap in console connectivity. But the Saturn was failing worldwide. It was expensive, difficult to develop for, and losing ground rapidly to the PlayStation. Sega's finances were collapsing. The idea of releasing a new revision of a failing console made no business sense. It would cost more to produce, would raise the price, and wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Developers and consumers had already moved on from the Saturn. The Atari Game Brain. Before becoming the company that defined home gaming, Atari experimented with several tabletop devices built around individual games. The Atari Game Brain was supposed to unify those experiences into a modular console that could play multiple titles using plug-in cartridges. The idea was smart. Instead of selling separate dedicated machines, Atari could sell one main system with modular expansion. But by the time the Game Brain was nearly ready, its internal hardware was already obsolete. The technology powering the device belonged to a previous era of gaming, a generation Atari was about to leave behind. Releasing it would have meant launching a system that looked outdated the moment it hit shelves. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten side of gaming history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Video Game Guy, and hit the bell so you never miss the next episode.